can't think of it now, but he was talking about the Delphi technique.
Uh-huh.
And I looked online and read a little bit about that. And I remember them doing similar techniques in school where it's group thinking, and they try to break you down where if you have an idea different than the group, then they try to use that as against you, as that you have the wrong idea. I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
Yes, the Delphi technique has been used for many, many years. It came out of the same institutions as the human potential movement, they called it. And the whole idea was they understood that a dynamic type leader could pretty well hypnotize an audience, especially if the people were already true believers. That's why they come to learn powers, etc., the inner powers and all the rest of it. But they also thought we could use this for persuasion purposes on councils, for instance, at council meetings where the public are invited in to listen in. And for the big changes that they wanted to do with the world, even right down to taking their water supplies from them, they would send in these particular characters that were taught in the Delphi technique, and they would set the stage, so to speak, so that the public who would come in, who would eventually have to give their consent for any of this to proceed, any projects to do with taking over your water supply, etc., they put plants in the audience. And what they do is they quickly are able to suss out those in the audience as well, who are the people pleasers, the ones who would bring the apples to the teachers if they were still back in school. And they would make eye contact with those ones. Therefore, if anybody stood up at the conference and asked a serious question that the man didn't want to be asked, or it was too hot on the topic, too truthful as to how the public would suffer if a particular bill or whatever was passed, you would get the people pleaser, to stand up and shout down at that particular talker. So it's a psychological process that's taught. And the whole idea, again, is to bring everyone to consensus by using simple Plato-type dialogue techniques where they'll lead you into a form of logic. They'll say, we all agree that gravity keeps you on the ground, and you'll say, yeah. If you jump off the ground, you'll come back down, yeah. And step by step, they'll take you along the topic if they want to take the water supply from you. And at first it will be logical. No one wants a poisoned water supply. That's correct. They'd all agree. And little by little, he'll take you in 180 degrees. And when the few in the audience who are not under the hypnotic spell of consensus, because people in groups all tend to want to agree with each other, but there's always the few who retain their individuality and can still think. When one person stands up and points out the obvious, the fact that they're going to be robbed of their rights, and they'll pay a fortune for this new installation to be brought in or whatever, the people pleasers then stand up together and shout down that, they'll say, quiet, you're disturbing the talk, you're disturbing and that's how it works. It's pure psychology, an old psychological technique, and these professionals are sent across the country. They're flown in to get their way. It's generally for continental-wide movements. For instance, they did that with the watershed bills that they wanted passed, where they could say that everywhere in the planet was a potential watershed, and that's to take all your rights of land away from you. But it was never presented to the public in such a straightforward fashion. They used the Delphi technique to make it happen. And ultimately, the people will give their own consent to their own demise. They will lose everything through consensus building.
And it's extremely effective on most
Very
individuals.
Effective. Yeah. Very more so today, because for the last 15 years, sometimes 20 years in different states and different places, they've been using it in school through groupthink, where they all sit in circles, and before anyone can leave the group or the circle, they must come to a consensus on everything. If one particular individual has a different opinion from the group or the mob, he's ostracized, and he's sent to Coventry, so to speak, until he realizes the errors of his ways and comes back and agrees with the rest of them. So they've already been conditioned to consensus.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Mr. Watt.
Thanks for calling. Yeah, we're run by psychology and psychiatry and science, and we are well understood because we're the most studied species on the planet. Now we've got Jim from Buffalo, New York on the phone. You there, Jim?
Yes, sir.
Yeah?
How are you?
Not so bad.
I've just been listening to your show. Great as always. You mentioned before, although you said it in a different context, about people nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
I'm convinced that it seems to me that nobody cares about anything.
Mm-hmm.
And when this kind of news, like you were telling, is when you try to put forth this info to people look at you like you have three heads.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess if they didn't hear it on CNN or Fox News, it's not true.
Yes.
And this goes, I guess it kind of blends right into what you were just saying about this Delphi technique. If people are being indoctrinated to think that way, then they're not going to think outside the box ever.
Yes.
It's a sad state of affairs.
It is. However, you go back into the books again and you'll find that many of the big players who understood and set up the think tanks that would eventually implement a lot of this agenda, like Lord Bertrand Russell, they stated in their own books that they would create a situation, a mental state of apathy amongst the general population, and they went into it in some detail as to how they'd bring this about. And the whole idea was through constant repetition of daily news with little blurbs coming from government agencies that people would psychologically begin to accept they were inferior, their lives were being controlled, they'd accept it, and that they didn't have rights, etc. All the thinking was done by their betters above them, these special people, and that's happened. You have a state of apathy where people feel that everything is out of their control anymore. And plus, with the wars on the family, which were very real wars, they were scientifically brought in to play and promulgated through magazines and talk shows and so on until you have a dysfunctional system. People are in an apathetic state. And when they're all divided and conquered, it's much easier to steamroll ahead with this scientific-type dictatorship that they plan to ultimately admit is being used on the public.
Right, and the mainstream media and advertising agencies do this to us every minute of every day.
Yes. Again, Bertrand Russell in the 1920s and again in the 50s reiterated that very point. He says we must bring the experts in psychological manipulation, he says Madison Avenue and the others, in to work with us because they understand how to motivate the public and make them do things they would otherwise not do.
Yep, and this is why we have a nation of sheep.
Yes.